The sun was sinking low over Meridian, drenching the border village in copper light as shadows stretched across the parched ground. Jacob trudged along the dusty trail, the strap of his empty water jug biting into his shoulder, sweat stinging his eyes. 14 years old and already scarred by loss, he carried himself with the wary posture of someone twice his age, eyes scanning for threats, even when no one was near. He had been this way since raiders slaughtered his family when he was 9, leaving him with only his fists, wits, and a stubborn will to survive. Trust was a luxury, hope an indulgence, and kindness a weakness that got people killed, or so he told himself every day. But the truth was more complicated, a flicker of something buried deep beneath the armor he had built. Today, that flicker was about to burn brighter than he could have imagined. The river came into view, swollen and wild from recent rains, its waters boiling with currents that hissed against jagged rocks. Jacob headed for his usual inlet, where the water slowed enough for him to fill his jug without being dragged under. His boots crunched on wet gravel as he approached, but his steps faltered when he spotted a shape on a moss-slick boulder near the edge. A Navari elder sat slumped, one leg twisted awkwardly, his staff lying across his lap. His skin, normally a radiant shade of deep ocean blue, was dulled to ash, his amber eyes ringed with pain. The alien's robes were damp and torn, and a makeshift bandage wound tightly around his injured limb. Jacob froze, every instinct screaming at him to back away. Humans and Navari had never been allies, only reluctant neighbors separated by suspicion and skirmishes. The Navari controlled the bridge upriver, charging tolls and punishing trespassers without mercy. The last thing Jacob wanted was to be seen aiding one of them. Yet the sight of the elder's strained breathing, the lines of dignity etched into his face even as he suffered, dug its way under Jacob's hardened shell. "You're a long way from your people," Jacob called, keeping his voice steady though his chest was tight. The elder's head lifted slowly, amber eyes sharp despite the weariness in his posture. "As are you human," he replied, his voice carrying the melodic cadence of the Navari tongue. Jacob's gaze slid to the raging water. "Need to get across?" The elder followed his line of sight and inclined his head. "My village lies beyond the forest. I was gathering roots when my injury betrayed me. The current is too strong for me now." Jacob hesitated, his throat dry. He could walk away, fill his jug, and pretend he never saw this. It would be easier, safer. But the words left him before he could stop them. "Let me help you across. No one survives here alone." The elder studied him in silence, as if measuring something invisible, then gave a slow nod. "I am Thorn." Jacob adjusted the jug on his back and moved closer. Jacob. With care, he helped Thorn to his feet. The Navari was taller, but lighter than expected, his weight pressing into Jacob's shoulder as they made their way to the edge. "There's a path of stones, hidden under the surface," Jacob explained, pointing to where the dam upstream softened the current. "Step exactly where I step." The elder's staff clicked against the rocks as they entered the water, icy currents surging around their legs. Each step was a battle, Jacob bracing against the pull as he bore most of Thorn's weight. Halfway across, the elder stumbled, nearly dragging them both under, but Jacob caught him, locking his arm around Thorn's waist and hauling him upright. "Almost there," he gritted, muscles burning as he fought against the river. At last they reached the opposite bank, collapsing onto wet soil, both gasping for air. Jacob helped Thorn to a fallen log, where the elder sat heavily, leaning on his staff. "You have my gratitude, Jacob of Meridian," he said formally, his voice stronger now. "Such kindness is unexpected." Jacob shrugged, trying to mask the tremor of adrenaline in his limbs. "Just did what needed doing." Thorn reached into his robe and drew out a small stone, smooth and glowing faintly from within, its warmth palpable even from a distance. He pressed it into Jacob's palm, and the boy flinched at the thrum of life that seemed to pulse through it. "This is a hearthstone," Thorn said. "Among my people, it marks a debt of honor." "You have earned it." Jacob shook his head. "No debt's necessary." But the elder's eyes glinted. "Honor is always necessary. Remember this moment." With surprising strength of one so injured, Thorn pushed himself up and limped toward the trees, disappearing into shadow. Jacob sat staring at the stone glowing in his hand, the river roaring behind him. He had no way of knowing that this single act helping an injured stranger across a raging current had already begun to shift the course of his life. Tomorrow, the Navarre would come knocking, and nothing in Meridian, or in his world, would ever be the same again. Morning light slanted through the cracks of Jacob's ramshackle hut, chasing away the damp chill of night, but he had overslept. The pounding on his door dragged him awake, his head thick with restless dreams, and the faint warmth of the strange stone still tucked against his chest. He staggered to the door, rubbing his eyes, ready to mutter some excuse to the magistrate's collectors about water taxes he couldn't pay. But when he pulled the latch, the words stuck in his throat. Standing outside were not taxmen, but Navarre, half a dozen of them, tall and proud, their skin glinting like polished sapphires beneath the sun. At their center leaned Thorn, staff in hand, but his posture was stronger, his amber eyes clearer than the night before. Jacob froze, heart hammering, suddenly all too aware of his tangled hair, worn shirt, and the pathetic state of his hut. "Good morning, Jacob of Meridian," Thorn intoned, amusement tugging faintly at his lips as he took in the boy's stunned expression. "I trust we did not disturb your rest," Jacob stammered. "No, of course not. I just wasn't expecting company." The others studied him with curiosity, but it was the one who stepped forward that made Jacob's breath catch. She was striking in a way he had never seen before. Her skin was a lighter shade than Thorn's, almost luminous in the daylight, and her long silver hair tumbled in waves down her back, adorned with beads that caught the sun like shards of starlight. Her eyes, bright and unguarded, met his with something like wonder. "This is my granddaughter, Lizana," Thorn said, pride threading through his tone. "She insisted on thanking you herself." Lizana dipped her head gracefully, her voice soft and melodic. "Your kindness to my grandfather has honored her family. Few humans would have done what you did." Heat rushed Jacob's cheeks, and he shifted awkwardly, wishing for once he had something better to say than the clumsy truth. "Anyone would have helped." Lizana tilted her head, a smile ghosting across her lips. "No, they would not. That is why you are different." Their gazes lingered, and Jacob felt something pass between them, an electric current he couldn't explain, but didn't want to break. Her cheeks deepened in hue, a Navarre flush, and the air thickened with unspoken possibility until Thorn cleared his throat, reminding them of the others' watchful eyes. "The Council of Elders has extended an invitation," the old man announced, his voice carrying the weight of ritual. "We would be honored if you would visit our healing springs. The waters there may ease the burdens of your hard life." Jacob blinked, uncertain if he had heard correctly. A human, invited into Navarre territory? Into their sacred springs? It was unheard of. He rubbed at the back of his neck, caught between suspicion and awe. "I'm not sure if I should," he admitted, the words heavy on his tongue. Zana's expression faltered, her luminous eyes dimming with disappointment. "Do we frighten you?" she asked softly. "No," Jacob replied quickly, then hesitated, his voice gentler. "It's just, our peoples don't exactly get along. Perhaps it is time that changed," Thorn said, his amber gaze steady. "Change begins with those willing to see beyond old wounds." Jacob's eyes flicked to Lizana again, her hopeful expression tugging at something inside him that had long been locked away. His empty hut loomed behind him, silent proof of the life he had. No family, no ties, nothing to lose. The hearthstone in his pocket pulsed faintly, as if urging him forward. "When would we go?" he asked. "Now, if you are willing," Thorn replied. "The journey is short, and you would return by nightfall." Jacob took a slow breath, squared his shoulders, and nodded. "All right. Let me grab my things." Minutes later, he walked among them on a hidden trail through the forest, the rhythm of their steps and the murmur of strange Navari words making him feel both like an intruder and like someone brushing against a secret long kept from him. Thorn led at a measured pace, but Jacob's focus kept sliding sideways to Lizana. She moved with effortless grace, her silver hair glinting, her presence both soothing and unervingly magnetic. "Your grandfather seems stronger today," Jacob said, breaking the silence. "Bedu helps his condition," Lizana replied, her smile tinged with warmth. "And perhaps the inspiration of your kindness." Jacob ducked his head, muttering, "I'm just glad he got home safe." She studied him openly, her expression thoughtful. "You are modest." "It is appealing." Their hands brushed as the path narrowed, and though she didn't pull away, Jacob's pulse jumped. She glanced at him curiously. "Tell me, are all human males with eyes like forest earth?" He blinked, caught off guard. "No, eyes come in all colors blue like yours, green, gray." She tilted her head, gaze lingering on his. "I find yours fascinating. They remind me of the soil where the sweetest roots grow." Jacob swallowed hard, his chest tight with unfamiliar heat, words failing him. The path grew steeper, the trees parting, and before them, the world seemed to open. Steam rose from terraces of water, carved into the earth itself, shimmering blue-green as though lit from within. Navari elders moved reverently between the pools, their chants carried on the wind. Jacob stared in awe, breath stolen by the beauty and strangeness of it all. "Welcome," Thorn said solemnly, gesturing toward the radiant waters. "To the heart of Navari." Lizana's cool fingers found Jacob's hand, their touch deliberate now, and she whispered, "The waters heal the body. But sometimes it is the spirit that needs healing most." Jacob's throat tightened as he looked down at their entwined hands, the hearthstone's glow bleeding faintly through his pocket. For the first time since his family's death, he felt the stirrings of something he thought long dead, a sense that perhaps his life was no longer just about survival. Something larger was unfolding, something that had begun with a single choice at the river's edge. The steam curled in delicate threads as Jacob followed, Thorn and Lezina deeper into the terraces, the pools glowing with a blue-green radiance that seemed alive. The Navari elders bowed their heads as they passed, their melodic voices weaving chants that made the air hum with reverence. Jacob's boots sank into the damp moss, and though his body was weary from the walk, his senses were sharpened, the strange mineral scent of the waters clearing the fog of exhaustion. He felt painfully out of place, an orphan from Meridian standing in a sanctuary. No human had ever entered, but Xana's fingers remained laced through his, anchoring him as if she refused to let him drift into doubt. At the edge of the second terrace pool, Thorn stopped and gestured for Jacob to remove his rough shirt and tattered boots. "The waters show truth beyond skin," he intoned. "Enter as you are." Jacob hesitated, self-conscious under so many alien eyes. But when Lana released his hand, only long enough to shrug out of her own ceremonial robe, and step gracefully into the glowing water, he felt a strange courage rise in him. He stripped down to the plain garment Thorn had offered and waded in, the liquid caressing his skin like silk. It wasn't just water. It seemed to pulse with a heartbeat, seeping into his bones, loosening the knots of old scars. As Jacob submerged himself fully, the hearthstone in his pocket flared to life. A surge of light spilled from beneath the surface, twisting upward in dancing rays, and the chants of the elders faltered into gasps. The water became vision, pulling Jacob into something vast and endless. He saw faces that were not his, yet somehow were. Humans and Navari standing side by side, building together, laughing together. He saw children with pink and blue hands tangled as they played. Then the images darkened, showing fire at the riverbanks, suspicion growing like weeds, and the Saurian-scaled reptilian forms, whispering poison into both peoples' ears until unity shattered and blood filled the waters. Jacob's breath caught as the visions shifted again, this time to his own face mirrored by a man of the past, strong and resolute, with earth-colored eyes. Beside him stood a Navari woman with silver hair and defiant beauty, her hand clasped in his. Together, they faced their divided tribes, and behind them, the river shone like a bridge of light. When Jacob surfaced with a gasp, the images had not ended. They were still spilling out of the hearthstone in bright arcs across the pool for all to see. The gathered Navari fell into stunned silence, eyes wide as their forgotten history unfurled before them. Then came a final jarring image that made Jacob's heart pound. Saurians in armor, red-eyed and merciless, advancing through the forests toward the springs. "They're coming," Jacob gasped, water streaming down his face. "The Saurians. They march even now." Valen, a sharp-eyed Navari with cold disdain, snarled from the crowd. "Lies! A human dares to profane our sacred waters with trickery." Thorn struck his staff against the ground, the sound reverberating like thunder. "The springs do not lie. You all saw." Chief Callan himself stepped forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over Jacob. His voice was calm but dangerous. "If the springs have spoken, then we stand on the edge of truth and danger alike. But no outsider can claim guardianship without trial." His gaze cut to Jacob, hard as flint. "The ceremony of revelation will decide if you are chosen or condemned." The crowd erupted in voices, some fearful, some curious, others openly hostile. Jacob stood trembling, not from the chill of the water, but from the enormity pressing down on him. He felt Lana's hand slip back into his, her grip fierce, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I saw what you saw," she whispered, so only he could hear. "You are not a trick. You are the bridge our people were promised." The hearthstone still pulsed against his chest, as if echoing her words, and Jacob realized with a shiver that what began as one act of kindness had already bound him to a destiny far greater than his own survival. The ceremony of revelation loomed before him, but so did the Saurian's shadow, and both would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. The village around the springs shifted as twilight fell, its tranquil beauty transforming into a place tense with unease. Fires were lit in carved stone braziers, their flickering light reflecting off Navari faces tight with suspicion or awe. Word of the visions Jacob had unleashed spread swiftly. Some elders whispered reverently that prophecy had awakened, while others muttered that a human boy had desecrated the sacred pools. Chief Kalin convened his council, his deep voice carrying over the gathering as he declared the ceremony of revelation would be held at moonrise to determine whether Jacob was truly chosen or merely an interloper. The announcement divided the tribe even further. Valen, sharp-featured and cold-eyed, sneered openly at Jacob, his words dripping with contempt as he warned that the Krell faction would never allow a human to claim the title of guardian. Jacob bristled under the weight of so many stares, the orphan instincts in him screaming to run, to hide, but he stayed rooted, the hearthstone thrumming against his chest as though to remind him that leaving was no longer an option. Not as the council dispersed to prepare for the trial, Xana drew him into a shaded alcove beneath hanging vines. Her silver hair caught the firelight in strands of molten light, and her eyes shimmered with defiance. "Do not let their doubt infect you," she urged, her hand sliding into his. I believe what the springs showed. I felt it in the water. The bond between us made it stronger. Jacob's throat tightened, a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through him. Your people think I'm blasphemy, he murmured. Maybe I am. I'm just me. A boy who got lucky surviving this long. Leanna's cool fingers pressed against his chest, where the hearthstone pulsed. No, Jacob, you are more. The springs never lie. They showed what once was, and what can be again. Her voice dropped to a whisper, her breath brushing his ear. And I have seen something too. Not in visions, but in you. A courage I've not seen in any Navari warrior. Her lips hovered near his, and before he could summon the will to pull back, their mouths met. It was a kiss unlike any Jacob had ever imagined, cool and electrifying, the heat in his body rising as if the hearthstone itself burned with their joined pulse. When they broke apart, breathless, she laughed softly, the sound like chimes. The springs will answer truth at moonrise. But before they do, I want no doubt between us. Jacob felt a dizzy mix of longing and fear, knowing every Navari eye would soon judge him. Yet in that hidden moment with her, the weight of their gazes seemed to matter less. He let himself believe, for just a heartbeat, that fate might have led him here, not only to unite peoples, but to find something he never thought possible connection. Their closeness was interrupted by the sound of boots on stone. Commander Marin emerged from the shadows, his expression stern. His loyalty to Chief Colin was legendary, his presence in the council unquestioned. Your absence is noted, boy, he said gruffly, his gaze flicking between them. Do not think you can avoid what is coming. He turned sharply and vanished back into the torchlight, but Jacob noticed a faint glimmer at Marin's collar, a red blink half hidden beneath his robes. Suspicion prickled in Jacob's chest, but the moment passed as the horns sounded, summoning all to the great terrace pool. Moonrise painted silver across the springs as the Navari gathered in concentric circles, their voices falling silent when Chief Colin raised his hand. Jacob stood at the edge of the highest pool, every nerve taut. The hearthstone glowed steadily, as though eager for what was to come, while Zana lingered close enough for their hands to brush. Across the crowd, Valen's stare was sharp as a blade, his lips curled in contempt. Thorn, leaning on his staff, gave Jacob the smallest of nods, a silent reminder that the act of kindness that began at the river had already carried him further than he ever dreamed. But Jacob's unease deepened as his gaze drifted to Marin again, the faint pulse of the device at his collar, flashing like a warning no one else seemed to notice. The ceremony of revelation would expose truth, but Jacob was beginning to understand that truth would not only come from the springs. There was betrayal here, hidden in plain sight, and before the night was done, it might destroy them all. The twin moons of the Navari world rose higher, their pale light rippling across the terraces of the springs, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Jacob stood waist-deep in the highest pool, the hearthstone pressed against his chest, its glow throbbing in rhythm with his pounding heart. The ceremony of revelation had begun. Chief Colin's voice rang out over the assembly, solemn and commanding, declaring that the springs would reveal the human boy's true nature before all. Elders circled with hands raised, their chants weaving through the night like threads of light, while warriors lined the perimeter with blades at their hips, ready to act if the judgment went against him. Jacob forced himself to submerge, the water wrapping him in its silken embrace, and the world dissolved into vision once more. He saw not only the past unity of humans and Navari, but flashes of what lay just beyond the tree line, the Saurians advancing, 30 warriors at least, scaled armor glinting crimson beneath torchlight, their movements precise, their hunger for conquest undeniable. Jacob gasped back to the surface, his shout carrying across the assembly. They're coming. The Saurians march even now. The hearthstone flared violently, projecting the image of the reptilian host above the water. The crowd erupted in cries of fear and fury, Valen shouting that it was deception, while Thorn thundered that the springs themselves bore witness. Callan's hand cut through the clamor. His sharp eyes locked on Jacob, reading both his fear and his sincerity. "If what you say is true," he said grimly, "then we stand on the brink of battle." Before he could speak further, a horn blast echoed from the eastern perimeter, followed by a second from the west. Panic rippled as scouts shouted that Saurians had breached both sides, their numbers greater than expected. Jacob's gut twisted. He recognized the pattern. It was a pincer strike, the same tactic raiders had used to destroy his homestead. His mind raced, connecting the vision to the unfolding reality, and then his eyes fixed on Commander Marin. The faint blink of the red device at his collar pulsed faster now, unmistakably a transmitter. Rage and clarity struck Jacob in the same instant. "It's him," he hissed under his breath to Callan. "He betrayed you. He's feeding them our movements." Callan's face darkened, but there was no time for argument. The first clash of steel and scaled flesh erupted beyond the terrace, screams mingling with the hiss of reptilian war cries. Jacob scrambled from the water, the hearthstone searing against his palm. He sprinted to the riverbank, Zana at his side, her silver hair flying as she kept pace. "The springs alone won't hold them," Jacob shouted. "The river, it's connected to the pools. I can feel it. If we channel its power—" She gripped his hand without hesitation, her cool skin steadying his trembling. "Then we'll do it together." They knelt at the water's edge, their fingers clasped around the hearthstone. The river answered with a deep hum, the current glowing faintly at first, then flaring into a surge of light that raced upstream against its own flow. Jacob felt the energy tear through him, burning and exalting, the stone acting as a conduit between his human will and Thana's Navari spirit. The glowing water rose like a living wall, encircling the springs just as Syrians broke through the outer defenses. Warriors hissed in frustration as the river itself barred their advance, its touch burning their scales with luminous scars. Back at the terrace, Marin drew his blade, his eyes wild with desperation. "Fools! The Syrians promised me power beyond your petty counsel." He spat, lunging for Jacob, but Callan was there, his ceremonial blades crossing with a clang that shook the air. With a roar, the chief disarmed his once trusted commander, sending him sprawling at Jacob's feet. The hearthstone pulsed, and Jacob unleashed a burst of energy that flung Marin backward into the glowing current. The river judged him instantly, dragging his screaming form beneath the surface where light consumed him whole. Silence fell for a heartbeat. Then the Syrians broke against the river's defenses, their formation unraveling. Trapped between Navari steel and the living current, they faltered, their leader hissing in disbelief. "No guardian has wielded such power in centuries." Thorn's voice carried above the din, staff raised high. "No guardian has ever been both human and Navari in spirit until now." The battle turned, not through blood, but through revelation. The Syrians, marked by the river's light, staggered and fled, their war cries breaking into panic as they disappeared into the forest. The glowing water receded, leaving only silence and the wide eyes of Navari warriors who stared at Jacob not with hatred, but with awe. Zana tightened her grip on his hand, her breath ragged, her eyes shimmering with something more than victory. Callan stepped forward, his expression torn between pride and disbelief. "The springs chose you," he said at last, "and the river has obeyed you. Human or not, you are now guardian." Jacob looked down at the hearthstone, its glow softening to a steady thrum, and then at Lance's luminous eyes, where hope and something more personal shone like a promise. He had come to the river as an orphan with nothing, and now he stood at its heart as the bridge between two peoples, his act of kindness blossoming into destiny. But the final vision still haunted him, the Saurians' true army, larger and hungrier, waiting just beyond the horizon. This battle had been only the beginning. The morning after the battle dawned unnaturally still, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and lingering smoke from the warriors' torches. Jacob stood at the edge of the springs, watching as the water's glow faded back to its usual gentle luminescence, as if the river itself were retreating into slumber after its fury. Around him, Navari villagers moved like shadows through the aftermath, repairing shattered barricades, tending to the wounded, and carrying away the few fallen. The Saurians had been driven back, their bodies scarred by the river's judgment, their cries of frustration still echoing in Jacob's ears. Yet beneath the relief that rippled through the tribe, he sensed an undercurrent of awe, fear, and something deeper, change. The boy who had been barely tolerated in Meridian was now looked upon as both savior and omen. He rubbed the hearthstone absently, its warmth steady against his palm, and wondered if he would ever feel ordinary again. Chief Callan approached, his imposing presence soft now by exhaustion and the weight of what he had witnessed. He studied Jacob for a long moment, as though seeing not just a boy, but the prophecy made flesh. "The springs and the river answered to you," he said at last. "Even I cannot deny what every eye has seen. You are guardian now, Jacob of Meridian, guardian not only of our sacred waters, but of the bond between our peoples." Jacob swallowed hard, struggling to find words. "I never asked for this," he admitted. "All I did was help someone who needed it." Colin's stern expression eased into something like respect. "The greatest burdens fall not on those who seek them, but on those who prove themselves worthy in small acts. My father once told me that." Behind him, Valen stood silent, his cold eyes burning with anger, but his tongue bound by the evidence of the river itself. His faction would not forgive easily, Jacob realized, but their opposition mattered less now. The truth had spoken through water and light. Lizana appeared then, her silver hair unbound, falling like a curtain of starlight over her shoulders. She walked directly to Jacob, ignoring the gazes of warriors and elders alike, and took his hand openly. "Among my people," she said softly, her voice carrying despite its gentleness, "when two souls bond in the springs and the river answers, it is considered a union more sacred than ceremony." Jacob's chest tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. "Among mine," he said with a tentative smile, "we call it a marriage, a promise of forever." Her eyes glimmered, and the faintest blush colored her cheeks. "Then we shall honor both traditions." Kalin watched them, a mixture of resignation and reluctant pride settling over his features. "It seems I have gained a son," he said, his voice solemn, "and perhaps a future neither of our peoples could have imagined." Thorn, leaning on his staff, chuckled quietly. When an orphan boy helps an old man across a river, the world shifts. "I told you honor is always necessary." That evening, under the twin moons, a celebration unlike any in living memory began. For the first time in generations, humans crossed the river willingly, invited guests rather than trespassers, and Navari children splashed alongside human ones in the shallows. Music rose, alien instruments blending with human voices in rough but joyful harmony. Jacob stood at the riverbank with Lana's hand in his, watching as suspicion melted into laughter and tentative bonds formed across the water. "One simple act," he murmured, his gaze drifting to the hearthstone glowing faintly against his chest. "That's all it took to change everything." Lizana rested her head against his shoulder, her voice soft but certain. "The simplest acts often carry the greatest power." Just as the mightiest river begins with a single drop, Jacob let himself breathe in that moment of peace, the warmth of her hand grounding him. Yet deep inside, he could not shake the final vision the springs had shown him, the vast Saurian army still waiting beyond the horizon, biding its time. Tonight was triumph, A fragile beginning, but tomorrow would bring a greater storm. He knew now that he would not face it alone. With Lana at his side, and two peoples no longer divided by the river, but bound by it, Jacob felt the stirrings of a destiny far greater than the one he had ever imagined. The orphan boy was gone. In his place stood a guardian, and the world would never be the same. The celebration stretched deep into the night, music echoing through the forest until even the stars seemed to hum with it. But as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with pale lavender light, the revelry gave way to quiet murmurs of worry. Scouts returned from the northern ridges with grim faces, whispering of smoke trails, trampled brush, and clawed footprints too numerous to count. Jacob stood with Chief Callan and Thorn on a rise above the springs, his hand unconsciously clutching the hearthstone. It pulsed faintly, as though sensing what was coming. "What you saw in the waters was no vision to frighten children," Callan said gravely, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It was a warning. The Saurians we drove back were only the edge of the blade. Their true force marshes still." Jacob swallowed hard, the weight of his new role pressing down like the river current that once tried to drag him under. "How many?" he asked quietly. Thorn's amber gaze was somber. "Too many for the Navari alone. Too many for humans alone. But perhaps not too many for both." Jacob looked down at the terraces below, where humans and Navari now mingled, cooking, sharing food, exchanging hesitant laughter. For the first time, the river was a bridge instead of a barrier. He realized then that the springs had not chosen him for strength or cleverness alone, but because he could stand in both worlds. "If we face them divided, we're finished," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his stomach. "But if we stand together, Navari and humans, we have a chance." Callan's jaw tightened, his pride warring with reason, but Lizana appeared at Jacob's side and slipped her hand into his, her luminous eyes never leaving her father's face. "You taught me that leadership is not about preserving the old ways, Father," she said softly. "It is about protecting the future. And the future stands beside me." For a long moment Callan was silent, the chief of a people burdened by centuries of mistrust. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well. We fight together." Word spread quickly, carried on whispers that grew into a wave of resolve. Messengers were sent across the river to Meridian, summoning human villagers to the springs. At first, suspicion met the call, but when they saw Jacob standing with the Navari, an orphan boy they had known, now clad in ceremonial robes, the hearthstone glowing against his chest, they hesitated, then followed. Old hatreds did not dissolve in a day, but the looming threat forced hands that might otherwise have stayed clenched. Humans brought their crude rifles and traps. Navari their spears, staffs, and living knowledge of the forest. Together, they began to weave a defense neither side could have built alone. That night, as Jacob and Lizana walked along the riverbank, torches glowing in the distance where humans and Navari labored side by side, the air was heavy with both hope and dread. "Do you regret it?" Zana asked, her voice no louder than the rustle of reeds. "Helping my grandfather that night? Taking this path that is no longer just yours?" Jacob stopped, looking out at the water that had begun it all. He remembered the old man's weight against him, the icy current threatening to sweep them both away, and the stubborn thought that he could not just walk away. "No," Jacob said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "If I'd left him, I'd still be nothing but a boy trying to survive another day. Now I get to fight for something that matters. For both of us." Lena's lips curved into a faint smile, and she leaned her forehead against his. The hearthstone flared between them, its light reflecting in the rippling current, as though the river itself approved. High above, on the ridge line where the forest met the mountains, the first glint of scaled armor caught the moonlight. The Saurians were coming, their army stretching like a dark tide against the horizon. The scouts' horns carried the warning across the valley, their low moans rolling over the springs like thunder. Jacob drew a slow breath, his heart pounding but his stance unyielding. "They're here," he said, gripping Lizana's hand tighter. Around him, humans and Navari raised their weapons side by side, the river and the springs glowing faintly, as if awake, aware, ready. Whatever the outcome, history had shifted. The orphan boy who once walked alone was now a guardian standing at the head of two peoples. And as the Saurians descended like a storm, Jacob understood the truth of Thorn's words. One act of kindness had not only changed his life, it had changed the fate of the world.